Good morning, everyone. I welcome you all to today's edition of our daily The Hindu newspaper analysis. This is not just a news discussion class. This is a structured examination preparation module where we dissect editorials from the perspective of the UPSC Civil Services examination. Before we begin, let me set the expectations clearly. I am not here to merely read out news. I am here to help you develop what UPSC calls analytical ability with clarity of expression. The ability to break down complex issues, identify their multiple dimensions, and present coherent arguments. Today's session is built on 10 major editorials spanning across 3 general studies papers. I have organized them into 5 teaching segments based on thematic coherence. This organization is not arbitrary, it mirrors how UPSC structures its questions, connecting issues across paper boundaries. The methodology I will follow today. For each editorial, I will first present the core facts and data points. Then I will explain the policy context and institutional framework. Finally, I will show you how this editorial connects to previous UPSC questions and how you can use this knowledge in your answer writing. I also want to highlight the unique value of The Hindu for UPSC preparation. Unlike other newspapers that focus on sensationalism, The Hindu provides analytical depth and institutional perspective. When you read The Hindu editorials regularly, you develop a vocabulary and conceptual framework that mirrors the UPSC answer writing style. Let me also remind you that I have provided detailed notes in the description box. Download them, print them, and keep them ready for revision. These notes are structured exactly like UPSC prelims, fact sheets, and mains answer frameworks. Now, let's begin our analysis. Governance, polity and constitutional reforms. The sunset of MGNREGA and dawn of VBG-RAMG. Let us start with a fundamental question. Why is MGNREGA considered one of the most important welfare legislations in independent India? The answer lies in its unique position as the world's largest demand-driven employment guarantee program. MGNREGA, passed in 2005, was built on a simple but revolutionary principle. The state owes a duty to provide work to any adult member of a rural household who demands it, for at least 100 days per year. This is not a charity. This is a statutory entitlement. Now, the government has decided to replace MGNREGA with the VBG-RAMG Act 2025, which will become effective from July 2026. This is a significant change, and I want you to understand the exact nature of this transformation. The key shift is from a demand-driven to a centralized hybrid delivery architecture. Under MGNREGA, if a person demanded work and was not provided within 15 days, the state had to pay unemployment allowance. Under VBG-RAMG, the system is more structured. The central government now determines the normative allocation for each state, meaning there is a predetermined budget envelope. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Under MGNREGA, imagine a restaurant where customers could order unlimited food and the government had to pay for it regardless. Under VBG-RAMG, the government now sets a budget cap, and the restaurant can only serve up to that amount. This is the fundamental shift in philosophy. For your prelims preparation, you must know MGNREGA was passed under Article 21's right to life and livelihood. The Supreme Court in Swaminathan v. State of Kerala, 2022. And several other cases has upheld the right to livelihood as part of the right to life. MGNREGA was seen as an operationalization of this constitutional principle. For mains, You need to understand that the transition to VBG-RAM-G raises serious questions about the right to work as a justiciable entitlement. The new act replaces this with what critics call a right to receive allocated work, a weaker claim that depends on budget availability. National floor wage, the 300 rupees statutory baseline. Let us now examine the wage structure. The government has instituted a statutory floor wage of 300 rupee per day across all states. This is significant because earlier, wages were notified separately by each state, leading to significant disparities. Now, let me explain the regional implications. 21 states had wages below 300 rupees earlier. They will now need to revise upwards. For instance, Uttar Pradesh will see an increase of approximately 48 rupees, Bihar around 45 rupees, and Madhya Pradesh approximately 39 rupees. But look at the upper end. Haryana pays 409 rupees, Goa 406 rupees, and Kerala 401 rupees. This tells us something important. India's labor market is deeply fragmented, and wages reflect local political economy rather than just cost of living. I want you to remember a key analytical point for your mains answers. Wage disparities in India are not just economic phenomena. They reflect historical patterns of labor market development, unionization strength, and political mobilization. Kerala and Haryana have strong labor movements, while states like Bihar and UP have historically had weaker labor organization. Also, remember the gender dimension. Female participation in MNREGA has been around 55 to 58%, much higher than the national female labor force participation rate. The wage floor has direct implications for women's economic empowerment in rural areas. For prelims, you should know that the concept of a national floor wage was first recommended by the Sarkaria Commission and later by various expert committees. The idea is to prevent wage competition between states that drives down labor standards. Fiscal devolution reset, the 60-40 shift. This is perhaps the most critical structural change in this segment. Under MGNREGA, the Union bore 90% of the material and administrative costs, with states contributing only 10%. Under VBG-RAM-G, the funding ratio has been changed to 60-40. Let me explain why this matters. When the Union bears most of the cost, the program is effectively centrally funded, and states have little fiscal risk. When states have to contribute 40%, they bear significant financial liability. The numbers are striking. State outlays are projected to increase from 27,700 crore rupees in FY25 to 1,51,000 crore rupees in FY27. That is a 600% surge. States like UP, Tamil Nadu, and Bihar will face a 6 to 8 times increase in their MGNREGA-related expenditures. This raises a fundamental question for your mains preparation. What is the impact on cooperative federalism? Cooperative federalism, as envisioned in the Constitution, requires balanced fiscal arrangements between the Union and states. The 15th Finance Commission increased the states' share in the divisible pool to 41%, giving them more untied resources. But VBG-RAM-G effectively reverses this principle by imposing tied fiscal obligations on states. You should be able to articulate this tension in your answers. The states are being given more untied resources through Finance Commission recommendations, while simultaneously being forced to bear more tied expenditure obligations through centrally sponsored schemes. This is a fiscal paradox that needs critical analysis. Budget allocations and 125-day guarantee. The new Act expands the employment guarantee from 100 to 125 days per household. This is a positive step on paper, but here is the catch. The union government now has absolute power to cap the normative allocation for each state. Let me explain what this means in practice. Previously, if a state had high demand for work, the central government had to release additional funds. Now, the central government predetermines a budget based on proprietary parameters that are not publicly disclosed. If actual demand exceeds this budget, the state must bear 100% of the excess cost. This creates what I call a demand paradox. States with high rural poverty and high demand for employment guarantee will either have to suppress work enrollment or run fiscal deficits. This is a perverse outcome for a program designed to address rural distress. For your prelims, remember the difference between normative allocation and actual demand. Normative allocation is based on central parameters, while actual demand reflects ground realities. The gap between the two will be the key metric to watch. Policy tensions and the Anup Satpathy Committee. Now let us examine the policy criticisms. The new wage of 300 rupees is below the 400 rupee standard recommended by worker rights panels. The Dr. Anup Satpathy Committee recommended 375 rupees as the national daily baseline to meet basic household consumption, nutritional, and essential needs. Let me explain who Anup Satpathy is. He is a labor economist who headed a committee constituted by the Ministry of Labor and Employment to review and recommend changes in the Consumer Price Index for industrial workers. The committee's recommendations carry significant technical weight in wage determination. For your mains answers, you should be able to discuss the concept of living wage versus minimum wage. A living wage considers the actual cost of living including food, shelter, healthcare, and education, while a minimum wage is often politically determined and may fall below the living wage threshold. The strategic policy recommendation I want you to remember is institutionalize automated central budgetary top-ups during climate anomalies. Why is this important? Because rural employment demand spikes during droughts and monsoonal failures, precisely when state fiscal capacity is most constrained. The counter-cyclical nature of MGNREGA was its key feature. The new framework risks making it procyclical, exactly the opposite of what is needed. Telecommunications Act 2023. Let us now shift to a completely different domain. The replacement of the Indian Telegraph Act 1885 with the Telecommunications Act 2023 is a landmark regulatory modernization. Let me give you the historical context. The Telegraph Act was enacted in 1885 to regulate telegraph communications during the British colonial period. Over the decades, it was amended multiple times to accommodate telephone, mobile, and internet services. But its fundamental framework remained rooted in 19th century communication paradigms. The new Act 2023 moves from a licensing regime to an authorization regime. What is the difference? Under the old regime, every telecom operator needed multiple licenses for different services, a license for mobile services, a separate license for internet services, another for long-distance calls, and so on. Under the new regime, there is a unified authorization that covers all services. For your prelims, this connects to the concept of regulatory reform and ease of doing business. The licensing regime was seen as a barrier to market entry, requiring extensive paperwork, multiple permissions, and long approval timelines. The authorization regime simplifies this. The new Act also introduces unified statutory anti-spam rules for the first time. This is important because earlier, spam regulation was fragmented across different rules and guidelines. Now, There is a direct statutory obligation on enterprises to prevent unsolicited communications. The three pillars of telecom authorization. The Act establishes a three-pillared authorization architecture. Let me explain each pillar clearly. Pillar 1. Principal rules cover major public telecommunications infrastructure and services. This includes mobile network operators, fixed-line providers, and major internet service providers. These are the entities that form the communication backbone of the nation. Pillar 2. Captive rules manage isolated private communication networks. Think of a large factory that has its own internal communication system, or a corporate office with its dedicated network. These are not providing services to the public, they are for internal use. The captive rules recognize this distinction and exempt them from public compliance burdens. Pillar 3. Miscellaneous rules categorize fringe digital communication functions. This is the flexible category that can accommodate emerging technologies that may not fit neatly into the principal or captive categories. For your mains preparation, the analytical point is that this three-pillared approach represents a shift from one-size-fits-all regulation to differentiated regulation. Different types of telecom services have different risk profiles and public interest implications, and the regulatory framework should reflect this. OTT networks and national security powers. Now, let us address the most controversial aspect of the new Act. The framework expands state controls to cover over-the-top platforms, that is, internet messaging and calling services like WhatsApp, Signal, and Telegram. Let me explain why this is happening. The old Telegraph Act defined telecommunication narrowly, covering only licensed telecom operators. When WhatsApp emerged and became the primary communication tool for millions of Indians, it fell into a regulatory grey zone. The government argued that messaging platforms should be subject to similar security obligations as telecom operators. The SIM-binding mandate for WhatsApp is a good example. The government has required that WhatsApp accounts be linked to a specific SIM card on a specific device to prevent misuse. This means if you change your phone or SIM, you need to re-register. On national security, the Act retains the power of senior bureaucrats to issue interception and monitoring orders without judicial warrants. This has been criticized by civil liberties groups as violating the right to privacy established in the Justice K.S. Puttaswamy v. Union of India, 2017, case. For your mains answers, the analytical framework is the national security versus individual privacy debate. You should be able to discuss how different jurisdictions balance these competing interests. The European Union's approach, with the GDPR and the e-privacy directive, provides stronger privacy protections. The US has sector-specific privacy laws with more state surveillance powers. India's framework leans towards state empowerment with limited judicial oversight. Commercial satellite internet and the GMPCS impasse. The removal of GMPCS, Global Mobile Personal Communications by Satellite references from the updated rules is creating uncertainty for satellite internet providers. Starlink, OneWeb, and other global satellite internet companies are waiting for clear regulatory pathways. The core issue is the pricing debate. There are two competing models for spectrum allocation for satellite services. Administrative pricing means the government assigns spectrum directly to operators based on technical requirements. This is the global norm for satellite spectrum because auctions are impractical given the cross-border nature of satellite signals. Telecom operators in India are pushing for spectrum auctions, arguing that satellite operators should pay for spectrum access just as terrestrial operators do. This is a level playing field argument. For your mains, this connects to the broader debate on spectrum management. Spectrum is a scarce national resource, and the pricing mechanism should balance efficiency, equity, and public interest. Administrative pricing favors satellite operators, auction-based pricing favors terrestrial operators. The government's choice between these models will determine the future of India's satellite internet ecosystem. Anti-spam, warrantless surveillance and privacy. The codification of anti-spam obligations under the Parent Act is a significant consumer protection measure. For the first time, telecom operators and digital platforms have a direct statutory obligation to prevent unsolicited communications, with penalties for non-compliance. However, the warrantless surveillance provisions remain contentious. The Act allows designated senior bureaucrats to issue interception orders on national security grounds without prior judicial approval. There is a post facto review by a multi-member committee, but civil liberties groups argue this is insufficient. For your prelims, remember the Puttaswamy judgment's triple test for privacy: 1. Legality, 2. Need, and 3. Proportionality. Any state intrusion on privacy must satisfy these three requirements. The warrantless interception provisions of the Telecommunications Act 2023 are being challenged on these grounds. Evaluating the 73rd Constitutional Amendment. Now, let us turn to a completely different but equally important issue: the state of grassroots democracy in India. The 73rd Constitutional Amendment, enacted in 1992, constitutionalized the Panchayati Raj system. It was supplemented by the PESA Act, 1996, provisions of the Panchayats, extension to Scheduled Areas, Act for Tribal Areas. Let me explain the constitutional vision. The amendment mandated three-tier governance structures, regular elections every 5 years, reservation of seats for SCs, STs, and women, and devolution of subjects listed in the 11th schedule. PSA gave additional powers to Gram Sabhas in scheduled areas, including the right to be consulted on land acquisition and resource management. However, the ground reality is different. Studies have shown a phenomenon called participation fatigue. Citizens are withdrawing from Gram Sabha meetings because they perceive their participation as having no real impact. Gram Sabhas have been reduced to administrative clearinghouses that merely rubber-stamp decisions already taken by high-level officials. For your mains, the analytical framework is the gap between de jure and de facto decentralization. De jure decentralization is what the Constitution says. De facto decentralization is what actually happens. The gap between these two is the measure of democratic deficit in rural governance. Evaluating the 73rd Constitutional Amendment. Now, let us turn to a completely different but equally important issue: the state of grassroots democracy in India. The 73rd Constitutional Amendment, enacted in 1992, constitutionalized the Panchayati Raj system. It was supplemented by the PESA Act, 1996, provisions of the Panchayats, extension to Scheduled Areas, Act for Tribal Areas. Let me explain the constitutional vision. The amendment mandated three-tier governance structures, regular elections every 5 years, reservation of seats for SCs, STs, and women, and devolution of subjects listed in the 11th schedule. PSA gave additional powers to Gram Sabhas in scheduled areas, including the right to be consulted on land acquisition and resource management. However, the ground reality is different. Studies have shown a phenomenon called participation fatigue. Citizens are withdrawing from Gram Sabha meetings because they perceive their participation as having no real impact. Gram Sabhas have been reduced to administrative clearinghouses that merely rubber-stamp decisions already taken by high-level officials. For your mains, The analytical framework is the gap between de jure and de facto decentralization. De jure decentralization is what the Constitution says, de facto decentralization is what actually happens. The gap between these two is the measure of democratic deficit in rural governance. Asymmetry in deliberative time allocations. The data here is striking. Gram Sabhas spend only 13% of their active meeting time on identifying, debating, and resolving critical local issues. Only 4% of time is spent on revenue generation or tax capacity discussions. The rest is consumed by subsidy verification and beneficiary list clearance. Let me explain why this happens. The administrative machinery generates a huge volume of paperwork for central schemes. MNREGA job cards, PMA housing lists, PDS beneficiary identification, all of this requires Gram Sabha verification. The meetings have become administrative compliance events rather than deliberative democratic forums. For your prelims, remember the concept of social audit. MNREGA mandated social audits by Gram Sabhas to ensure transparency and accountability. But if 87% of meeting time is spent on non-deliberative activities, the quality of social audit suffers. The critical UPSC insight. This structural imbalance turns local self-governance bodies into administrative extensions of the center rather than autonomous deliberative institutions. This is a clear violation of the constitutional vision of grassroots democracy. Digitization challenges under PESA. The Nirnay app is designed to ensure transparency in Gram Sabha proceedings through real-time digital uploads. The intent is commendable. But the implementation has created unintended consequences. Local secretaries, often overburdened and undertrained in technology, spend significant time on data entry and compliance. Meeting discussions get reduced to perfunctory proceedings because the focus is on completing digital formalities. The elite capture problem is severe. Because attendance is not compensated as a social protection measure, only the affluent and politically connected can afford to attend meetings. This marginalizes the very populations, vulnerabilities, women, landless laborers that PESA was designed to empower. The server error pretext is particularly troubling. Officials inform tribal workers that their employment claims failed due to server errors. A clear case of bureaucratic workaround that denies legitimate claims. For your mains, analyze this through the lens of digital colonialism or technological paternalism. When technology is imposed from above without adequate training and support, it becomes a tool of exclusion rather than empowerment. The right to say no in tribal beltways. The Hasdeo-Arand case study is a textbook example of how state structures subvert the spirit of PESA. The Hasdeo-Arand forests in Chhattisgarh are home to tribal communities who have historically depended on these forests for their livelihood. Despite PESA's requirement of Gram Sabha consent for land acquisition, mining leases have been granted. How does this happen? The state uses what I call manufactured consent. Low attendance pretexts, proxy representation, and manipulated documentation. The legal form is satisfied, the substantive consent is absent. The policy prescriptions are clear. First, reinstate the legal consent power of Gram Sabhas with adequate safeguards. Second, establish fiscal autonomy to remove the dependency that makes Gram Sabhas pliable. Third, respect local decisions, even when they say no to development projects. For your mains, this connects to the broader debate on development-induced displacement and environmental justice. The right to say no is fundamental to democratic governance, and its erosion in tribal areas represents a serious constitutional violation. The Navlekar Panel. On 26 May 2026, the Ministry of Home Affairs established a high-level committee headed by former Supreme Court Justice Prakash Prabhakar Navlekar. This committee was set up following a declaration by the Prime Minister, indicating the highest level of political prioritization. The committee's mandate is to study abnormal demographic modifications driven by unvetted cross-border migration. This is a politically sensitive issue, and the choice of a former Supreme Court judge as chair lends institutional credibility. For your mains, understand the broader context. India's borders with Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepal, and Sri Lanka are characterized by historical migration patterns, porous borders, and complex citizenship issues. The demographic changes in border districts have political, economic, and security implications. The committee's findings will likely shape future policy on citizenship, border management, and demographic planning. For your interview preparation, be prepared to discuss the balance between humanitarian concerns for refugees and security concerns about undocumented migration. The 16-year statistical vacuum and census 2027. India is operating with data that is 16 years old. The last comprehensive census was conducted in 2011. The 2021 census was postponed due to COVID-19, and now the timeline has been pushed to 2027. This is unprecedented in independent India's history. The census is not just a head count, it is the foundational database for all planning, policy formulation, and resource allocation. Schemes like the delimitation of constituencies, reservation of seats for SCs, STs, distribution of central funds, and implementation of welfare programs all depend on census data. For your mains, the analytical point is that the statistical vacuum creates a policy blindness. We are making decisions for 140 crore people based on data that is over a decade old. The 2027 census roadmap has two phases. Phase 1 is house listing and housing operations, with a deadline of 30th September 2026. Phase 2 is population enumeration, scheduled to begin in March 2027. Mapping border anomalies. The Navlekar panel is using targeted questionnaires to state chief secretaries and conducting field evaluations in border stress points. The focus is on districts bordering Bihar, Nepal, and other international borders where significant population shifts have been observed. The critical concern is that rapid demographic changes in border areas can shift constituency demographics, alter political representation, and strain local resources. This is both a national security issue and a federalism issue. For your mains, understand the concept of borderland governance. India's border regions are often characterized by distinct political economies, ethnic compositions, and security dynamics. Effective governance in these areas requires understanding these specificities. The electoral role as a demographic diagnostic tool. The Special Intensive Revision, SIR, conducted by the Election Commission has resulted in the deletion of 6.5 crore names from voter rolls, representing 11% of the pre-revision voter universe across 13 states. This is a massive exercise with significant implications. On one hand, it is being used as a tool to audit demographic changes and remove ineligible entries. On the other hand, it has resulted in the exclusion of legitimate voters, particularly married women who migrate across administrative boundaries. The documentation trap for women is severe. Indian women traditionally relocate to their marital homes after marriage, but voter registration systems require documentation linking individuals to specific addresses. When documentation requirements are rigid, married women can lose their voting rights. For your mains, frame this as a gender and citizenship issue. The right to vote is a fundamental right under Article 326, and its denial due to documentation barriers violates constitutional principles. The Election Commission must balance the integrity of electoral rolls with the inclusion of eligible voters. Human rights protections and policy balance. Placing the legal burden of citizenship proof on rural electors who may have limited documentation is a serious concern. Without robust safeguards, demographic verification can become a tool of arbitrary exclusion and even statelessness. The solution framework includes establishing secure, transparent, and localized digital feedback channels for verification processes. This ensures that legitimate voters are not excluded due to documentation gaps. For your prelims, remember the Citizenship Act, 1955, and the concept of burden of proof in citizenship determination. In most democracies, the state bears the burden of proving that someone is not a citizen, not the individual proving they are. India's framework, particularly post-CAA 2019, has shifted this burden in some contexts. The syllabus synthesis is important. This issue connects GSI, social diversity, GS2, citizenship governance, and GS3, internal security. For your answer writing, demonstrate this multidimensional understanding. Before I continue, I want to take a moment to request something. If you are finding this detailed analysis useful for your UPSC preparation, please subscribe to our channel. We are committed to providing free, high-quality content for UPSC aspirants. Hit the bell icon to get notifications for our daily sessions. Also, share this video with your friends who are preparing. The larger our community, the more we can support each other. Now, let us continue. The public exam system crisis. The integrity of public examinations is fundamental to merit-based vertical mobility in India. For millions of young Indians, competitive examinations are the primary pathway to government jobs, professional courses, and upward social mobility. When examination systems are compromised, the social contract between citizens and the state is violated. Aspirants invest years of preparation, often borrowing money, foregoing employment, and making significant sacrifices. If the system is rigged, their efforts are devalued, and trust in state institutions erodes. For your mains, connect this to the broader concept of institutional trust and social mobility. The legitimacy of state institutions depends on their perceived fairness and effectiveness. Examination fraud undermines both. Maharashtra TET case study. The June 2026 Maharashtra teacher eligibility test postponement affected over 6 lakh rural candidates. This case study reveals the anatomy of organized examination fraud. The investigation exposed a cross-border racket. The syndicate operated through coordinated nodes in Agra and Delhi, with printing press insiders as key operatives. Established coaching institutes functioned as recruitment and monetization fronts. The economics of the fraud are staggering. Commercial coaching networks paid over 1.5 crore rupees for master answer keys, while individual aspirants paid 1.5 lakh rupees for leaked materials. These numbers reveal a mature black market with organized supply chains. For your prelims, understand the legal framework. Paper leak cases are prosecuted under multiple statutes, including the Indian Penal Code, the Information Technology Act, 2000, the Criminal Law Amendment Act, 2018, which introduced Section 477 specifically for examination-related offences, and state-specific laws like MACOCA. Identifying leak points in supply chains. The supply chain for examinations has 3 critical vulnerability points. First, the custody vacuum. State testing bodies hand over raw paper manuscripts to private commercial printers up to 2 months before exams, without adequate state supervision. This extended custody period creates opportunities for insider leaks. Second, the supply pool exposure. Closed pools of trusted testing experts frequently cross over into coaching networks. This is a conflict of interest that needs structural management. Third, transit tracking failure. Physical cargo packages carrying question papers are not tracked through tamper-proof digital chains or live GPS. This creates opportunities for mid-transit breaches. For your mains, analyze this through supply chain management principles. The movement of examination materials involves multiple custody transfers, each representing a potential point of compromise. Effective security requires end-to-end tracking, sealed custody, and personnel vetting at every stage. Statutory hardening, MACOCA, and technical remediations. States are invoking the Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act, MACOCA, to combat examination fraud. This is a significant development. MACOCA is a stringent anti-organized crime law that provides for extended custody periods, presumption of guilt for certain offenses, and enhanced penalties. The application of MACOCA to examination fraud cases signals the state's recognition of these as organized crimes, not isolated incidents. This enables more aggressive investigation and prosecution. The technical remediations are threefold. First, statutory hardening through laws like MACOCA. Second, biometric hardening through computer-based testing with multi-factor authentication. Third, supply hardening through cryptographic watermarking, GPS-tracked transport, and daily key rotation. For your prelims, understand the concept of defense in depth in security architecture. Multiple layers of security are more effective than a single robust layer because the failure of one layer does not compromise the entire system. Executive accountability and ministerial responsibility. The doctrine of ministerial responsibility is a cornerstone of parliamentary democracy. Ministers are collectively responsible to the legislature for the actions of their departments. When examination systems fail under a minister's watch, the minister must answer. The policy prescription is clear: education ministers at both central and state levels must assume direct accountability for examination integrity failures. This means either fixing the problem or resigning. The failure to enforce this norm erodes institutional accountability. For your mains, connect this to the broader concept of executive accountability in a parliamentary system. Unlike the presidential system, where the executive is directly elected and accountable to the people, the parliamentary system relies on legislative oversight. When ministers evade accountability, the entire system of checks and balances is compromised. The World Bank's multilateral green funding pivot. The World Bank Group has dropped its mandatory 45% climate co-benefits mandate. This is a major policy shift with global implications. The 45% mandate required that nearly half of World Bank project financing be directed toward activities delivering climate benefits. The primary driver is pressure from the United States, the bank's largest shareholder. The US has demanded a return to traditional economic growth metrics, arguing that climate mandates distort investment decisions. For your mains, understand the governance structure of multilateral institutions. The World Bank operates on a weighted voting system where shareholders' voting power is proportional to their financial contributions. The US holds approximately 16% of voting shares, which is enough for a veto on major decisions requiring supermajority. This pivot reflects broader shifts in global politics. The US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement and similar policy reversals are reshaping multilateral institutions. For developing countries like India, this creates uncertainty in climate finance flows. Inputs versus outcomes, the rhetoric shift. The US Treasury has criticized fixed climate allocations as rigid input mandates that distort economic decisions. The new framework shifts from measuring inputs, how much money was spent on climate projects, to outcomes, what results were achieved. This is being presented as a more efficient approach. However, critics argue that outcome-based metrics give the bank more flexibility to fund projects that are not genuinely climate-aligned while claiming developmental benefits. For your prelims, understand the difference between input-based and outcome-based evaluation. Input-based evaluation measures resources allocated, while outcome-based evaluation measures results achieved. The challenge with outcome-based evaluation is attribution. It is difficult to determine whether an outcome was caused by the specific intervention or by other factors. Financial threats to India's adaptation projects. The shift in World Bank funding priorities poses specific risks to India's climate adaptation projects. The Atal Bhujal Yojana is a community-led groundwater management program that World Bank has been supporting. Reduced climate finance threatens the continuity of such initiatives. The Kosi Basin in Bihar is one of India's most flood-prone regions. Climate change is intensifying flood risks, making adaptation infrastructure critical. The World Bank's policy pivot endangers projects like embankment reinforcement and flood forecasting networks. Mangrove restoration along India's coastlines is crucial for cyclone resilience. The Sundarbans in West Bengal and the mangrove forests along the western coast serve as natural barriers against storm surges. Reduced funding for these initiatives weakens India's disaster resilience. For your mains, frame this within climate justice. Developing countries like India have contributed least to historical emissions but face the worst climate impacts. Reduced multilateral climate finance shifts the adaptation burden onto these vulnerable countries, raising fundamental questions of equity. Transition blind spots in freight, storage and industry. The reduction in dedicated climate funding affects multiple sectors. Freight logistics decarbonization requires capital-intensive shifts to electrified rail grids and inland waterway systems. India's freight sector is heavily dependent on road transport, which is carbon-intensive. Shifting freight to rail and waterways requires massive investment. Renewable storage innovation is at risk. Battery energy storage systems are essential for addressing the intermittency of solar power. Without storage, renewable energy cannot provide reliable 24/7 power. Reduced funding threatens the development of utility-scale battery systems that are meant to be integrated with solar parks. Industrial transition faces bottlenecks. Green hydrogen is critical for decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors like steel, cement, and fertilizers. These sectors have emissions intrinsic to their industrial processes, making them particularly difficult to decarbonize. Green hydrogen offers a pathway, but requires guaranteed long-term finance. For your prelims, understand the concept of hard-to-abate sectors. These are sectors where carbon emissions are inherent to the industrial process. Examples include steel, where carbon is used as a reducing agent, cement, where limestone calcination releases CO2, and fertilizers, where hydrogen production from natural gas is carbon-intensive. Navigating transnational funding volatility. India's response to the World Bank pivot involves both domestic mobilization and international coordination. On the domestic front, India is scaling up green finance through instruments like green bonds and institutions like the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund, (NIIF). Green bonds are debt instruments specifically earmarked for projects with environmental benefits. On the international front, India is working with BRICS and G20 to advocate for reliable, long-term multilateral adaptation funding. The new Development Bank, NDB, established by BRICS nations and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, represent alternative multilateral financing sources. For your mains, understand the concept of South-South cooperation and multipolar world order. The retreat of Western-dominated multilateral institutions is creating space for alternative institutions led by developing countries. This is part of the broader shift in global power dynamics. GST Revenue Analysis, June 2026. India's GST collections for June 2026 reached 1.95 lakh rupees crore, marking an 8.9% year-on-year growth. However, the structural composition of this growth is concerning. Import-driven GST revenue grew by 35%, while domestic GST revenue grew by only 6.5%. This indicates that the growth is not broad-based but is heavily concentrated in imports. For your prelims, understand the components of GST. CGST, Central GST, is levied by the central government on intrastate transactions. SGST, State GST, is levied by state governments on intrastate transactions. IGST, Integrated GST, is levied on interstate transactions and imports. The 35% growth in import GST reflects both volume increases and value inflation due to global commodity prices. Import reliance structural fault lines. The share of domestic tax contributions in the total GST pool has declined from 74% to 69% year-on-year. June 2026 marks the 16th consecutive month of double-digit growth in import GST revenues. This trend is concerning because it suggests that India's tax base is increasingly dependent on imports rather than domestic production. When the economy depends heavily on import taxes, it becomes vulnerable to global supply chain disruptions and trade policy changes. For your mains, analyze this through the lens of economic sovereignty. An economy that relies on imports for its tax base is essentially taxing consumption of foreign goods. This is sustainable only as long as the import flows continue. Domestic production-based taxation is more sustainable and creates stronger backward and forward linkages in the economy. The inverted duty trap. The inverted duty structure is a critical issue. Normally, raw materials should have lower tax rates than finished products to incentivize domestic value addition. In an inverted duty structure, raw materials have higher tax rates, which traps corporate capital in unutilized input tax credits. For example, if a manufacturer pays 18% GST on raw materials but the finished product attracts only 12% GST, the manufacturer accumulates unutilized tax credits. This is essentially working capital locked up in taxes, which increases the cost of production and makes domestic products uncompetitive against imports. The strategic remedy is to deploy unutilized PLI, production-linked incentive, funds toward domestic component manufacturing. The PLI schemes were introduced to boost domestic manufacturing in identified sectors, and unutilized funds should be redirected toward filling critical gaps in the manufacturing value chain. For your prelims, understand the concept of PLI schemes. These are designed to boost domestic manufacturing by providing incentives based on incremental production. The goal is to reduce import dependence and create global manufacturing champions from India. Retail demand and supply shock overlays. Domestic retail demand remains sluggish despite robust import-driven GST growth. This divergence reveals that while manufacturers are using imported inputs, and consumer demand is not accelerating. Freight inflation and global input cost escalations are inflating the landing value of imports, which automatically drives higher GST collections. This is a value effect, not a volume effect. Even if import volumes remain constant, higher prices lead to higher tax collections. Compliance pain points persist. Complex input tax credit rules, prolonged dispute resolutions, and the requirement for multiple GST registrations across states all add to the compliance burden. This is particularly challenging for small and medium enterprises. For your mains, discuss the GST Council's role in addressing these structural issues. The GST Council, chaired by the Union Finance Minister with state finance ministers as members, is the key forum for resolving GST-related issues. Its ability to forge consensus between the Union and states is critical for GST reform. Building structural fiscal resilience. The primary policy imperative is to reduce dependence on import tax receipts. The economy must build a robust domestic manufacturing base that can sustain tax revenue growth through internal production, not import consumption. Long-term fiscal resilience requires deep structural adjustments. These include correcting inverted duty structures, simplifying compliance, and bringing currently untaxed sectors like natural gas, aviation fuel, and real estate into the GST net. For your mains, frame this within the broader debate on tax reforms in India. Direct taxes, income tax, corporate tax, are considered more progressive and growth-friendly, while indirect taxes, GST, are regressive but easier to collect. The ideal tax structure balances both, with a higher reliance on direct taxes as the economy matures. Coal chemistry, strategic lessons from the Strait of Hormuz. The 2026 maritime blockade in the Strait of Hormuz exposed India's acute vulnerability in hydrocarbon imports. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow passage through which approximately 20% of global oil trade passes. Any disruption to this passage has immediate consequences for global energy markets. India responded by diversifying its import sources, scaling non-Hormuz sourcing from 55% to 70%. However, the fundamental dependence on crude oil imports remains an existential risk. For your prelims, understand India's energy import profile. India imports approximately 85% of its crude oil and 50% of its natural gas requirements. This makes the economy highly sensitive to global energy price movements and geopolitical disruptions. DME, the hydrocarbon substitute molecule. Dimethyl ether, DME, is a clean-burning synthetic gas that is chemically similar to LPG. It can be produced from coal through gasification, providing a domestic alternative to imported LPG. The key advantage is distribution compatibility. DME can be blended into existing LPG cylinders and pipelines without requiring infrastructure overhaul. The Bureau of Indian Standards has ratified a maximum 20% DME-LPG blend, enabling commercial integration. For your mains, explain the chemistry of coal gasification. Coal gasification converts coal into synthesis gas, syngas, which is a mixture of carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and other gases. This syngas can be converted into various products including DME, methanol, and synthetic natural gas. Forex preservation through energy indigenization. The economic impact is substantial. A 20% domestic DME blend can displace approximately 6.3 million tons of foreign LPG imports annually, saving 34,000 crore rupees in forex outflow. India has the world's second largest coal reserves, estimated at over 300 billion tons. This represents a massive strategic asset that can be leveraged for energy security through coal-to-chemicals technologies. For your mains, calculate the macroeconomic impact. Forex savings improve the current account deficit, strengthen the rupee, and reduce India's vulnerability to global commodity price volatility. This is a significant economic sovereignty dividend. Scaling to commercial viability. The commercialization pathway for coal gasification has 3 phases. Phase 1 involves technology development through CSIRNCL, Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, National Chemical Laboratory, Research. Phase 2 involves capital deployment through the 37,500 crore rupees cabinet scheme targeting 100 million tons of coal gasification by 2030. Phase 3 involves risk mitigation through 30-year linkage tenures and 20% capital subsidies. For your mains, understand the concept of capital subsidy versus operational subsidy. Capital subsidies reduce the upfront investment burden, which is critical for capital-intensive projects like coal gasification plants. Operational subsidies reduce ongoing costs but create long-term fiscal liabilities. Scaling to commercial viability. The commercialization pathway for coal gasification has 3 phases. Phase 1 involves technology development through CSIRNCL, Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, National Chemical Laboratory, Research. Phase 2 involves capital deployment through the 37,500 crore rupees cabinet scheme targeting 100 million tons of coal gasification by 2030. Phase 3 involves risk mitigation through 30-year linkage tenures and 20% capital subsidies. For your mains, understand the concept of capital subsidy versus operational subsidy. Capital subsidies reduce the upfront investment burden, which is critical for capital-intensive projects like coal gasification plants. Operational subsidies reduce ongoing costs but create long-term fiscal liabilities. INSA, the Unified National Energy Framework. The Indian National Science Academy, INSA, has proposed a unified national energy framework to address the multiple competing objectives of energy policy, security, affordability, and net zero emissions by 2070. India's commitment to net zero by 2070, announced at COP26 in Glasgow, requires massive transformation of the energy system. However, this long-term goal must be balanced against immediate imperatives of energy security and affordability. For your mains, understand the energy trilemma, the challenge of simultaneously achieving energy security, energy equity, universal access and affordability, and environmental sustainability. Different countries prioritize different dimensions of this trilemma based on their specific contexts. Pillars 1 and 2: Resource adequacy and equitable access. The INSA framework rests on 4 pillars. Pillar 1 is resource adequacy, which involves securing diverse energy supplies through a balanced mix of traditional fossil fuels and clean energy sources, building robust grid and storage infrastructure, and cultivating resilience against supply disruptions. Pillar 2 is equitable access, which guarantees dependable energy to every citizen, strengthens last-mile distribution connectivity, and accelerates decentralized local energy installations. For your prelims, understand the concept of resource adequacy in power systems. This refers to having sufficient generation capacity to meet demand reliably, including during peak hours. A diverse energy mix: coal, gas, hydro, nuclear, solar, wind, provides resilience against supply disruptions from any single source. Pillars 3 and 4: Affordability and appropriate sustainability. Pillar 3 is affordability, which keeps the energy transition economically viable for households, small businesses, and heavy industries through efficient markets and innovative financing. Pillar 4 is appropriate sustainability, which rejects one-size-fits-all environmental mandates and instead designs solutions tailored to India's unique resource layout and developmental needs. This includes a just transition, focus on supporting communities dependent on coal. For your mains, discuss the concept of just transition. As economies shift away from fossil fuels, workers and communities dependent on coal mining and coal-fired power face economic disruption. A just transition ensures these workers are provided with alternative livelihoods and that communities are not left behind. Core enablers, CCUS and system integration. The primary mandate is deploying technology and circular strategies to lower industrial emissions. The framework emphasizes a phased implementation approach to support emerging technology development. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, is a critical technology pathway for hard-to-abate sectors. CCUS involves capturing CO2 emissions from industrial processes, either utilizing them for other purposes or storing them permanently in underground geological formations. For your prelims, understand the difference between CCUS and CCS. CCS, carbon capture and storage, involves permanent storage of CO2, while CCUS includes utilization pathways that convert captured CO2 into useful products like chemicals, fuels, or building materials. The Unified Energy Architecture. The Unified Energy Architecture views coal, natural gas, solar, biomass, and other sources as complementary rather than competing. This approach recognizes that India's energy transition will be gradual, and a diverse portfolio provides resilience. The shift from capacity to value means moving beyond simply adding generation capacity to optimizing what the energy system delivers. This includes reliability, flexibility, sustainability, and affordability. For your mains, discuss the concept of system integration in energy transition. This involves coordinating different energy sources, storage systems, and demand-side management to optimize overall system performance. A well-integrated system can balance variable renewable generation with dispatchable conventional generation. Unchecked AI risks, the governance dilemma. The UN Independent Scientific Report has issued a stark warning. AI advancement is outpacing both scientific understanding and regulatory capacity. Science can no longer guarantee that next-generation AI systems will not cause catastrophic harm. The regulatory trap is a critical concept. Regulators lack the empirical evidence and foresight to design proactive policies, even as the technology evolves exponentially. This creates a dangerous gap between technological capability and governance capacity. For your prelims, understand the evolution of AI governance globally. The European Union's AI Act, which came into force in 2024, is the most comprehensive regulatory framework. It classifies AI systems by risk levels and imposes corresponding obligations. India has not yet enacted a comprehensive AI law, relying instead on sectoral guidelines. Agentic systems and physical limits. The AI landscape is shifting toward agentic systems that operate autonomously to execute complex tasks. These systems can perceive their environment, make decisions, and take actions to achieve specified goals. However, this growth faces physical constraints. Training large AI models requires massive computational resources, which translates to significant electricity consumption. High-quality training data is also becoming scarce. The concentration of frontier AI development in a narrow US-China commercial dynamic creates vulnerabilities for other countries. Export controls on advanced AI chips and models by the US have highlighted these dependencies. For your mains, discuss the concept of technological sovereignty. As AI becomes increasingly important for economic competitiveness and national security, dependence on foreign AI systems creates strategic vulnerabilities. India's push for sovereign AI capabilities through the India AI mission reflects this concern. India's strategic AI framework. India's AI approach prioritizes social utility and inclusive development. The National Strategy for Artificial Intelligence, (HASH-A for All), emphasizes AI deployment in healthcare, agriculture, education, and other sectors with high social impact. However, foreign export controls on AI technologies have exposed India's reliance on external systems. To achieve long-term digital autonomy, India must balance open-source global innovations with domestic capital backing for sovereign foundational models. For your mains, discuss the open-source versus proprietary debate in AI. Open-source AI models allow countries to build capabilities without depending on foreign proprietary systems. However, the most advanced AI capabilities are predominantly proprietary. Building competitive open-source models requires significant investment in research and infrastructure. Social risks, deepfakes and bioweapons. The proliferation of deepfakes, AI-generated synthetic media, poses severe societal risks. These can be used to defame public figures, spread misinformation, and destabilize political processes. The technology has become increasingly accessible, making it difficult to regulate. Bioweapon risks are equally concerning. Advanced AI models could potentially be misused for engineering synthetic biological weapons. Strict safeguards are required to prevent dangerous applications. The challenge in AI governance is balancing algorithm transparency with concerns about state overreach. Transparency in algorithm design is necessary for accountability, but it should not devolve into tools for selective censorship. For your mains, discuss the dual-use nature of AI technology. The same capabilities that enable drug discovery and medical research can potentially be misused for harmful purposes. Effective governance must address both the benefits and risks of AI. Multilateral AI verification. Managing AI risks requires global cooperation. Independent evaluation networks must be established to audit computational impacts and verify data sources. These mechanisms are essential for assessing systemic risks before global deployment. The foundational principle is clear: the world cannot govern what it cannot understand. Continuous collaboration between computer scientists, legal experts, and regulators is required to construct robust oversight frameworks. India must champion equitable global governance models that ensure broad access to AI utilities while protecting digital sovereignty. This includes preventing digital weaponization and corporate monopolies. For your prelims, understand India's role in global AI governance. India has been advocating for a balanced approach at international forums, emphasizing AI for all and equitable access. The India AI mission and the proposed India AI compute capacity represent domestic efforts to build sovereign capabilities. Judicial redlines in national security law. The Karnataka High Court's recent ruling on UAPA has established critical judicial precedents. The court rejected a legal challenge to UAPA provisions, affirming that national security takes precedence over individual relief in certain circumstances. UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, 1967, is India's primary anti-terrorism legislation. It provides for the designation of organizations as terrorist organizations, the designation of individuals as terrorists, and special procedures for investigation and trial. For your prelims, understand the key provisions of UAPA. The Act was significantly amended in 2004, 2008, and 2019. Key provisions include Section 15, Terrorist Act, Section 38, Membership of Terrorist Organization, Section 39, Support for Terrorist Organization, and the controversial Section 43d(5), which provides strict bail conditions. For your mains, discuss the constitutional balance between national security and individual rights. The courts have generally upheld the expansive powers granted to the state under UAPA, while also emphasizing the need for procedural safeguards. The tension between these two principles is a critical area of constitutional law. Digital and clandestine money flows. Recent investigations have exposed sophisticated terror financing networks, including the US-based Timothy Initiative. These networks exploit financial loopholes to channel funds to conflict zones. A primary digital mechanism involves foreign-issued debit cards used for cash withdrawals in left-wing extremism (LWE) zones. The anonymity provided by international cards and the lack of real-time tracking create vulnerabilities. For your prelims, understand the institutional architecture for combating terror financing in India. This includes the National Investigation Agency (NIA) for investigation, the Enforcement Directorate (ED) for financial crimes, the Financial Intelligence Unit (FIUNT) for financial intelligence, and coordination with international bodies like FATF. Internal Security Policy Remediation. The policy response operates on 3 levels. First, interagency coordination through real-time data sharing between the ED and FIUNT. Second, regulatory reform through geographic transaction auditing in vulnerable regions. Third, actionable intelligence through automated risk alerts for anomalous transactions. For your mains, discuss the concept of financial intelligence as a security tool. Modern security threats are increasingly funded through complex financial networks. Disrupting these networks requires sophisticated data analytics, interagency coordination, and international cooperation. The Enforcement Directorate (ED) enforces economic laws and combats money laundering under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act (PMLA) 2002. The Financial Intelligence Unit (FIUNT) receives reports from financial entities about suspicious transactions and analyzes them for patterns of money laundering or terror financing. UAPA due process and constitutional safeguards. Section 43d(5) of UAPA places a high burden on the accused for bail. The court must be satisfied that there are no reasonable grounds for believing the accusation is prima facie true. This is a higher threshold than regular bail provisions. For your mains, discuss the concept of due process in the context of national security laws. Due process requires that the government must respect all legal rights owed to a person before depriving them of liberty. The expansive powers under UAPA must be balanced against due process requirements. The risk of executive power being weaponized to suppress dissent is real. If charges are not subjected to immediate judicial scrutiny, legitimate civil society work could be branded as unlawful activity. The solution lies in regular judicial review, strict compliance with investigation timelines, and evidence-based investigation. Emerging transnational financial security threat vectors. Modern extremist financing is shifting to digital platforms. Cryptocurrencies enable rapid cross-border fund transfers outside traditional banking systems. Encrypted messaging supports untraceable Hawala networks. These developments require updated regulatory frameworks. Pillar 1 is decentralized crypto. Virtual assets and token cryptography allow global syndicates to move funds rapidly across borders, creating decentralized banking systems outside state oversight. Pillar 2 is encrypted messaging. Untraceable Hawala networks, and encrypted communication chains establish pathways that circumvent financial tracking systems. Pillar 3 is the global FATF framework. India must strengthen coordination with the Financial Action Task Force to monitor virtual asset movements across foreign jurisdictions. For your prelims, understand the concept of the travel rule in cryptocurrency regulation. This rule requires that originator and beneficiary information accompany virtual asset transfers above a certain threshold. It aims to bring cryptocurrency transactions under anti-money laundering oversight similar to traditional wire transfers. As we conclude this comprehensive session, let me provide you with a synthesis framework for your answer writing. First, understand the interconnection between segments. The governance reforms connect to the demographic concerns. The economic issues relate to the energy security concerns. The internal security challenges stem from the technological and economic vulnerabilities discussed in earlier segments. Second, develop multidimensional analysis. For any UPSC question, move beyond one-dimensional answers. A question on MGNREGA replacement should address not just the Act's provisions but also fiscal federalism, rural employment, and electoral politics. Third, use data points effectively. The numbers I have shared: 6.5 crore voter deletions, 600% surge in state expenditure, 11% voter universe affected, 34,000 crore rupees forex savings, 8.9% GST growth, are powerful tools for your answers. Use them to substantiate your arguments. Fourth, connect current affairs to static syllabus. The editorials we discussed today connect to fundamental concepts like cooperative federalism, fundamental rights, fiscal policy, energy security, and internal security. Demonstrate this connection in your answers. Fifth, practice answer writing. Knowledge without articulation is incomplete. Take any editorial we discussed today and write a 150-word answer within 7 minutes. This practice will build your speed and precision. I also want to remind you that UPSC preparation is a marathon, not a sprint. Consistency is more important than intensity. Daily newspaper analysis, regular revision, and answer writing practice are the 3 pillars of success. Our channel provides daily analysis sessions like this one. I also recommend referring to the standard texts for your general studies papers. The combination of current affairs and static knowledge is what produces toppers. Let me end with a motivational note. The journey of UPSC preparation is challenging, but every challenge is an opportunity for growth. Trust the process, stay consistent, and success will follow. Dear students, today's session was extensive, but I believe every minute was worth your time. We covered 10 major editorials spanning governance, demographics, economy, energy, technology, and security. If you found this session valuable, please subscribe to our channel. Your subscription motivates us to create more such detailed content. Share this video with your fellow aspirants. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied. For those who want structured preparation, our premium courses cover the entire general studies syllabus with daily current affairs integration. The details are in the description. The PDF of today's class notes is also available in the description. Download it, print it, and use it for revision. I will see you in tomorrow's class with another set of important editorials. Until then, keep studying, keep growing, and keep believing in yourself. Jai Hind. Jai Bharat.